Welcome to this session on our penultimate day of this year's Festival of Learning, and we're really excited to have you here. My name's Grace from London Funders, and my colleague Aura is in the room as well. This festival is really an opportunity for London Funders members to come together to share learning, ideas, and really be inspired by each other in the funding community and civil society as well. We've had a really packed programme this festival, and it finishes tomorrow with our festival finale, and we'd love to see you there if you can attend, and we'll drop that link in the chat for you. We'll also be sharing out the huge amount of learning that we've collected over the festival back out to our members over the summer as well. We'll also be live tweeting today from @London Funders, and the hashtag is Festival of Learning 24. And we're really encouraging all our speakers and attendees to get involved in line. So please do join the conversation on whatever socials you're using. Just to note, we're also recording this session today, so we can make sure we capture everything. If there is anything that you would not like us to broadcast, please just drop myself or Aura a message and we'll make sure that's removed. And other than that, I will pass over straight away to our speakers, Rebecca and Kieran from Disability Rights. Thank you for joining us today.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Grace and Aura. That's a wonderful introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just because I think it's just always best to get kicked off. Can everyone see my screen just to ask those questions? Okay, awesome. So I can just about see the chat, and a lot of today's conversation is going to be chat focused. So please let me know if there's any specific comments that you would like to voice, and put your hands up. I struggle to see it all, and I'm on presenter mode. So Grace and Aura, would it be okay if you just let me know if there's any sort of hands raised or things like that? Okay, brilliant. So hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Taylor-Edwards, and I am the DPO Development Manager at Disability Rights UK. I am joined today by Kieran Lewis at the National Survivor User Network, who co-produced these slides with me, and these slides were also co-produced with the Asian People's Disability Alliance, of whom the CEO Zeenat Jeewa has also recorded some messages to send over to everyone today, but sadly can't be with us. But yeah, please definitely look Ensign and the APDA up, and Kieran will have his moment to sort of talk about his work later on. I wondered if we could, before we get into sort of introducing myself and the topic at hand, I wondered if you wanted to take a moment to introduce yourselves and your organisation. The conversation of intersectionality, as we've learned over the last few years, tends to be one that's sort of got a lot of confusion around it, and it's from my experience a lot more useful to start off from a relational point of view, to work with to really an understanding perspective from funders' positions, and then work with us going forward. So please go ahead and introduce yourself, your organisation. Let us know some of the experiences of intersectional funding that you've had, whether you haven't had any, or your thoughts about intersectionality. And while you do that, then I'll go ahead and introduce myself and DR UK, which is Disability Rights UK. Just to let you know, we will be using the chat function for a lot of today's session, really as our interactive session. This is a very much an introduction into intersectional funding justice. So there isn't a lot to say other than getting everyone on the road, but there is an opportunity to ask lots of questions. So please use this as an opportunity to get comfortable with the process. And I might, with everyone's permission, read some of them out. And if you would rather your comments not be read out to the entire like group here, then please just put it in brackets in your comments, and I will make sure not to read them out and have that recorded in the presentation. But as I said before, my name is Rebecca Taylor-Edwards, and I am from Disability Rights UK. We are the national human rights charity that is led by, run by, and working for disabled people's organisations. And we work with disabled people's organisations and the government to promote the fundamental human rights and equity of all disabled people. And in my role as the DPO Development Manager, I work in co-production with what we understand as representative organisations. Just to let that's a key term for the rest of the day, to break down the barriers that they specifically face in their pursuit of social justice. And this is really where we have come to the understandings that we have come to on funding justice, and really specifically intersectional funding justice. And it is from those voices of these organizations that our knowledge comes from. And therefore, it's also really important to take an additional minute to pay homage and introduce these organizations. And I've thrown around the term DPOs, or disabled people's organizations, a few times, just so we're clear on what this sector is. It is a sector of 200 at a minimum count of organizations, groups, so charities, CICs, even all the way down to things like student unions that are led by and controlled by disabled people. At minimum, 50% of our 50% of the staff on our organizations identify as disabled. And if some of us have a board of trustees, so for example, if we are a charity, 75% of the board identify as disabled as well. And this makes us somewhat different from other organizations that speak a lot about disability but are not themselves disabled or do not hire disabled people. And our organizations work fundamentally to promote the social model of disability. And what that means is we talk about the way in which societal structures of disablement oppress our community, of which we self-represent. And really importantly, amongst the sector of DPOs are intersectional disabled people's organizations. And these are the experiences that we're going to be talking about today. And just like DPOs broadly, they are defined by the fact that they self-identify as the community they serve. They are organizations led by and controlled by disabled people with additional or sometimes multiply intersecting identities. So for example, Regard being the only organization led by disabled LGBTQ+ community members. We also have the Asian People's Disability Alliance, which we'll be hearing from today. Chronically Brown, Definitely Women, Birthing Ourselves are some of the organisations that we at Disability Rights UK work with, but the National Survivor User Network also work with their collection of intersectional organisations, and Kieran will be talking about their experiences as well. What we know is that across the sector of social justice, there are multiple of these organisations that represent communities with multiple intersecting communities, and these are the organisations that we're going to be talking about today. And through working with these organisations and asking them to really inform these slides, but also talking to a lot of funders over the years about their experiences of funding justice, we've sort of come up with a three-part framework to talk about intersectional funding justice. And the first really talks about that conceptual framework from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw that talks about that starting practice. And then we say, well, what works about this framework for our sector? And then how can we take this framework into a strategic position that funding organizations can take to start doing this work really well? And then the key theme being the fact that we focus primarily on the building of relationships. So Kieran's going to talk a little bit about how we suggest you do that. And then finally, we're going to be talking about the big flashy barriers that we've accumulated in our knowledge of over the last few years. And finally, we're going to spend a good 10 minutes. Hopefully we have enough time because it's a lengthy conversation to really talk about the strategies that an organization might want to take, really from you as individuals who work within a funding organization, and the things that you might want to consider doing over the next 5 years. But we'll break them down with you, and hopefully it's not too scary at all. So over the last decade, individuals who have worked in human rights, in philanthropy, and in social justice have spent a lot of time talking about intersectionality. And we've been part at Disability Rights UK, a part of lots of these conversations in boardrooms and consultings. And the question that we often get asked, and I often get asked in my work, is, this is all really great and we love this concept and we think it's really important, but what does that actually mean in terms of actual practice? What do we do? What's next? And how do we do it well? How do we do it in a way that doesn't recreate harm, which is a really key theme of today? And how do we not go into intersectionality and then just do additional harm to the communities who are most marginalized in society? And we're going to start off with that question. Let's have a look at the starting concept. Oh dear, my slides are ahead of me today. So the starting concept of intersectionality was first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black woman, a lawyer, and an academic, who introduced the term intersectionality to pay specific homage to the existing political mindset of individuals who have gone before us. So what this means is that conversations that resist concepts like single issue politics, so the resistance of movements that specifically, for example, just look at racism, that just look at misogyny, that just look at homophobia, transphobia, ableism in its isolation, has been challenged for quite a long time, even before we had the term intersectionality. But intersectionality itself was brought to us as a legal term, as Kimberly Crenshaw was, of course, a lawyer. And in her original text, she talked about the fact that single issue politics and movements in law did not often consider the experiences of what was often referred to at the time as multiple marginalization. And she just talked about how that prevented in law, again, Black women from receiving the justice for the discrimination that they faced. The idea of intersectionality talked about, specifically for Black women, talked about how racism and sexism compounded and interacted together to create its own form of discrimination, of which we understand as misogyny, where Black women themselves, their lived experiences are at the meeting point between racism and sexism. And of course, the construct has since been taken forward to talk about the multiple ways in which individuals with multiple identities have also experienced their own unique and holistic form of discrimination in society. Crenshaw's work asked us that in order to be inclusive of these experiences meant that we had to work differently. And that's really the sort of challenge to our organizations going forward. And in order to break down why a lot of funding organizations and other actors in social justice have difficulty with this term, we want to be quite clear about the fact that the starting concept was an academic one. It was also brought to us in a legal context. And for those who exist outside academia, who works in grassroots or supports grassroots organization, working differently looks very different from individuals who work in law. And so what does it mean to work differently as individuals who don't work in law? Well, it also means that we may need to have to take a different perspective or position on intersectionality. And the solution that we put forward to individuals who work around supporting social justice is to take a social justice position to intersectionality. Why is that important? Well, just like in challenges like co-production, we often find that larger organizations or organizations that are used to doing the same sort of work in the same way have difficulty in attempting to do this work without repositioning their grounding as an organization. What it often leads to is ineffective practice. And what ineffective practice often leads to, and that is specifically if you're thinking about it from a board of trustees point of view, wasted times and costs when you have to do it all over again, and you will when you do it wrong. But rather importantly, what we also know is that when you do things wrong from the wrong grounding and attempt to do work that requires an individual to be quite radical from an internal point of view before you do it outwards, is that you recreate harm. And social justice, when done well in intersectionality, attempts to undo a lot of that harm and work inwards before you work outwards. So what does that mean? Well, it requires organizations to be strongly decolonial, equitable, to promote a justice-based power distribution, or really more importantly, a redistribution of power and resources, and to be grounded in the acute awareness of representation, or how I often have to really specify in my role as authentic self-representation, because there's a key difference there. Justice often presents larger organizations who are used to, again, doing the same things the same way for a long time as a big challenge. But the beauty of a social justice framework, as Audre Lorde says, is that there are no new ideas. The expertise already exists. And the beauty is that we just need to tap into it and do so in a way that pays homage to the expertise and supports them adequately and respectively to do so. This expertise has been existing amongst community organizations for millennia before the term intersectionality had existed before, which is why a lot of the exercises we're going to go forward with you today is much less of a tick box strategy guide on how to quote unquote do intersectionality from your existing perspective and position of your organization, although we will be going through some timelines with you, and much more of a conversation about how to reposition your organization to support and equitable relationships with the individuals who are already experts in these conversations. So I've thrown around a lot of jargon to you, and please let me know if I haven't sort of broken down some of the jargon, but let's start off with the key ones. Before you on your screen is 4 versions of the same image. And the constant amongst the 4 images is that there are 3 people, one who is of taller heights, one who is of medium height, and one who is of the shortest height. And they're all trying to access a cricket game, although I think it's a cricket game. Please let me know if it's wrong. I'm not a big sport person. And they're all trying to access or view the game in the background. So that's the inclusion in society. And what individuals in social justice often understand the reality of the situation is that the individual who can already see over the fence that is preventing the 3 individuals from seeing the game, they in society are often given the most resources. So in the first image titled reality, you can see that they've been given 3 and they can see well above that fence. And the individual who is of medium height, they've been given 1 block, 1 resource, so they can just about see over the fence. But what we understand is that an individual of the shortest height who is most marginalized and often multiply marginalized is not only not given the resources to see over the fence, but is also dug into an additional hole by additional versions of harm in our society. And individuals who attempt to target this injustice can take an equality approach. So they can evenly distribute the resources between the 3 individuals. But the problem with that is often that the individual who doesn't need it is still given more resources than they need to see over the fence. The person who is at medium height can just about see over the fence the same, but the person who's the shortest height still can't see over the fence because they're not giving the equitable distribution of resources. Equity requires us to distribute power to those who are most marginalized in society. So what do we mean by power? In the context of funding organizations, we mean resources. So this can include, obviously, funding, but also additional forms of resources like the consultation processes that are given to us in Funder Plus models, capacity building exercises, and really interestingly, importantly, decision-making power on where funding should go and how our relationships with these organizations should be held. And distributing that equitably or giving it the most to those who are most marginalized in society is how we achieve equity. Justice, on the other hand, requires us to break down the structures entirely, to remove the fence. And we will be talking a little bit about how we do that going forward. But let's start off some of our exercises by asking you 3 questions. And the first question I'm going to give you to just think about, to not put into the chat just yet. We'll be bringing it up at the end of the conversation. But I want to ask you where you think funding organizations are demonstrated in this metaphor. Are they the grass, the cricket game, the resources? What do you think is the funding organizations? They could be more than one, just to let you know. And then the second one, I'm also going to now give you the opportunity to put into the chat. Considerate of the position that we're going to take going forward, which is a social justice position, what is doing intersectionality in funding? And really importantly, what isn't doing intersectionality? And if you feel comfortable, please go ahead and put them into the chat and let me know if you don't want me to read them out to the group. Okay, so I'm going to read some of the things that people have put in. So Ruth Stevens had just said in terms of what is doing intersectionality to think about intersecting identities and communities when looking at portfolios or funding, whether in a specific place or not. We've also, we've got quite a few points. So in terms of recognizing the multiple identities that people are bringing with them. In terms of what isn't, require people to choose one identity. That's really great, thank you. In terms of we've also got starting with an awareness. That's really great, to talk and listen, both internally and externally, and in turn turning talk into action. That's really great. Thank you, everyone. And I'm going to continue because I have my own add-ons and I'll try and break them down with you. So I've had quite a few of these similar conversations with funders before. And the first thing I would like to just go ahead and say isn't doing intersectionality is what we often classify as tick boxing. Sometimes they're classified as like that sort of showing off superficial point of view. And in funding, the go-to response is usually to go ahead and create a funding scheme for intersectionality, and that makes sense. It is very natural to your job. We often want to pause an individual's desire to go ahead and start that off straight away, particularly when any sort of intersectional scheme is doing very much of the same thing. It's creating the exact same schemes in the exact same way, except for this one is titled intersectionality. And when we ask you to pause that, we do ask, if the schemes have been structured the exact same way to serve specific communities, potentially take a moment to reflect on what communities are already benefiting from your schemes, what organizations are already benefiting from your schemes. Is it the individuals who, as everything already has the resources to jump through different hoops and the filtering out process of who is worthy of funding and who isn't? Or is it potentially the organizations that have the least amount of resources? So for example, don't have a fundraising manager, aren't clued into all the key terms and the jargon or the buzzwords, do into co-production, but don't know the terminology, things like that. And so the first thing that we say is certainly doing intersectionality. Well, of course, we do advise the creation of schemes around intersectionality. We do say that it must occur in parallel to or even after if it requires breaking down the existing barriers. So this has already been put into the chat. The existing barriers across all of your schemes. And we consider it of intersectionality. We ask you not only to break down some of the barriers, but the several layers of which barriers exist. And this is a particularly critical exercise, and it takes a long time to look through all of the ways in which funding has been distributed as your organization. To do it justly means that you have to do it all the way. It requires the same amount of critical reflection as who benefits from your funding schemes to who and what communities hold power within your organization. And those sorts of ideas have already been put forward onto the chat, and redistributing that power going on. So of course that means staffing, but of course in conversations like this, and I think this is a very common topic amongst individuals in this space, we know that isn't just your officers and your volunteers, but it is also your leadership, your CEOs, and really importantly, your board of trustees. But it also asks you who is financially benefiting from your consultative processes. Are the consultants that you hire, the individuals that sit on your recommendation boards to decide what's next, or the consultants you hire from your Funder Plus models, representing communities with multiple intersecting identities? Are they themselves the communities that you wish to support and redistribute power towards? And then of course funding is also included in that. However, the place that we really focus on this when talking about power distribution is distributing those resources to self-representative communities, groups, and organizations from on all levels. And in order to do that equitably, it must be relational, which is what Kieran's going to be talking to us about in a little bit. But I do want to take a moment to break down this sort of notion of representation. And I'm going to go ahead and ask you again for a few questions on what representation means. So the questions are these. What does representation mean in your work? And that could be your work as a wider organization, or that niche part of funding, of the funding machine that you work in. And then the second is much more reflective. it asks us the general, very broad question of, is it actually important for a community to speak for themselves? Is it always important for a community to speak for themselves? Does it matter whether they're being spoken for or not? And then the last question, or add on to that second question, is why? And that's a really important foundation to break into. So I'm going to pause again and ask you to sort of give those insights. Okay, we've got one comment in the chat so far, so I'll read that out. Okay, we've got two, so I'll start reading them out now. We've got a comment that says, I would say it's not only important for communities to be able to speak for themselves, but it's crucial. Their experiences are what then leads to their work. Great, thanks so much for that. We've got another comment that says, we ask funding projects if they are quote unquote people-led, which means the same thing, being developed and directed by communities that they serve. It is very important. However, this shouldn't be extractive and exhausting. It's also very important to listen to what's already being said many times, as I said in the beginning. And we've got another comment saying, representation means having people with lived experience of that which are trying to fund communities. We are trying to support on the decision-making boards concerning these groups and issues. It is important because they would know best and what works for them and what's needed. It's really great. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to
Sorry, Rebecca, you've just got on mute. We didn't hear that last bit.
Oh dear. Okay. What was the last bit that I disappeared on?
I think it was just reading out some of the comments in the chat.
Oh, okay. Shall I reread them then? Or did you hear that already?
Yeah, we heard that already.
Oh, okay, that's great. Thank you so much. So I'll answer my 2 cents on the question then. And I often use the example of my work before working in Disability Rights UK. I've worked in different areas of human rights, but my first grassroots organising experience was working for the Black Lives Matter movement and organising up in Birmingham. And as we all know, it was a large global movement, but in the UK, the movement's represented by a sole organisation that receives the majority of the supportive funding, of which they then redistribute to the community. And the question I often ask is, bearing in mind that this is a single issue conversation, and we'll move on to this being intersectional, is if, for example, the organisation was not led by Black people. And we often ask this question because when it comes to representation, there are certain communities where there's a very immediate response to representation sort of being very visceral. When I talk about BLM being led by Black people or non-Black people, that's a sort of very standard yes or no answer. A lot of people would say, no, that's not okay. But then when we move on to other forms of identities, like, for example, the disability rights movement, this is a much more common experience where our organizations are not represented by disabled people. And then we find this even going further on when we're talking about intersectionality, that a lot of the funds, or the very limited funds, albeit when it comes to intersectionality, are distributed to individuals who do not represent the communities that they serve, but they also do not represent their intersectional experiences. And in order to uphold the fundamental asks of justice and human rights, there requires us to redistribute our funding specifically to those communities that are talking about intersectionality before it was a buzzword. I often shy away in this work about talking about the cost effectiveness of funding self-representative organisations, but I know you do have boards of trustees and the finance committee to answer to. So what I often talk about is when we're considering the multiple layers of oppression and targeting those multiple layers or funding it, non-representative organisations may know very well on how to take away one layer, and they're probably going to do it very quickly and cost effectively because they've done this work before and have been financially supported to do this work for a very long time. A standard single issue organisation that is representative will know how to take away quite a few of those barriers. But it is the intersectional organisation that is self-representative that understands how all of these barriers interact and therefore hold the solutions to breaking down the system of oppression entirely. So what Zeenat, the CEO of the Asian People's Disability Alliance, often talks about is the fact that single issue organisations are very zoomed in on their experiences of an issue, but it is self-representative intersectional organisations that are zoomed out. They look at the entire picture because they've experienced it. And to work with these organisations means gaining the holistic picture of the entire system from providing sustainable work that provides a lot more for your beneficiaries. So we've talked a little bit about these representative organisations. Where are they and what are their experiences? Of course, I started up the conversation before specifically paying homage to intersectional organisations. So we have Regard, as I said before, definitely women. And I would also like to take a moment to pay homage to the voiced experiences of the Asian People's Disability Alliance, which is a registered charity led by and controlled by Asian disabled people. Please let me know if you hear this.
I'm Zeenat. I represent Asian People's Disability Alliance. We are an intersectional DDPO. We do exist, and we work around and have been since our inception, working on the barriers that people face in their everyday lives.
Zeenat also talks a little bit about the types of challenges that they work with going forward.
It's where we have a service user who is from Asian heritage and is trying to access a public transport bus, and whilst trying to navigate to get herself onto the bus, she's faced with verbal abuse, racial abuse, because there is another individual with a pram and a child in the space that she should be using, and she gets the brunt of the situation because of her heritage, her colour, and her being a wheelchair user. So those are the types of issues that we are trying to address.
That's great. And what we've learned from working with these organisations is that social justice requires us to break down a lot of the traditional structures of bureaucracy and formality when interacting with them. And this is where I hand over the stage to Kieran to talk a little bit about the National Survivor User Network's processes of doing just that.
Cheers, Rebecca. So yeah, I'm Kieran. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the policy officer at the National Survivor User Network, or NSUN. We're an England-wide network of groups and individuals with lived experience of mental ill health, distress, and trauma. And I'm gonna, well, before I get into that, we're an infrastructure organisation, so we're not a funder. We support our members with kind of communications infrastructure, help with policy work and campaigning, and navigating the funding landscape sometimes as well. So that's where I'm coming from, and I'm here to provide a bit of context to our work around mental health and migrant justice, and also explain what that has to do with intersectional funding, and also how to build equitable relationships with these sort of representative grassroots groups that Rebecca's been speaking about. So this work of ours started maybe like a year and a half ago when NSUN realized that a number of its existing members and adjacent groups were migrant-led groups or individuals with lived experience of the immigration system that were also doing work around mental health. And so as an infrastructure organization, we wanted to find out what we as NSUN could do to help them and what support we could offer them. And so in order to answer these questions, we wanted to speak to as many groups working on these issues at this intersection between mental health and migrant justice as we possibly could. So we identified lots and lots of these groups and kind of got out to see if they wanted to have a chat to us so that we could understand more about what their work is like on the ground, what problems they experience. And that went quite well. We were able to have lots of conversations with lots of different groups, including the Asian People with Disability Alliance. So I knocked on Zeenat's door and introduced myself and started a conversation there about the mental health impact of Asian People with Disability Alliance's work. And so through these conversations, we were able to go from not really knowing much about the work that was happening at the intersection of mental health and migrant justice to having a pretty clear picture of a lot of the problems that grassroots groups operating in that space face. So we heard that a lot of groups were overstretched, providing practical support to the communities that they're part of. And as such, they didn't really have the time or resources to campaign in the way that they might like to. They also didn't really have time to connect with organizations sort of similar to themselves, which would also be conducive to campaigning. So it's kind of the thing that they weren't able to do because all of their time and resources were going on responding to the impacts of bad government policy in real time. So off the back of that, we found that there was interest in like among these groups in coming together once a month on Zoom to kind of have a chat, get to know each other a bit better, keep each other posted about work that they were doing. So we started, these monthly meetings of this mental health and migrant justice coalition so that we could kind of, keep up to date with what everybody was doing. And so the groups could also sort of build a collective voice and do a bit of collective problem solving around, common problems that they had. And if you could just jump to the next slide, Rebecca. So as in this group, as we kind of got to know each other and the groups became more comfortable meeting every month, what emerged was that there was a really strong desire among the groups to put out some sort of public statement about their interactions with funders and funding practices that they felt were preventing them from doing the work that they wanted to be able to do. And so this group collectively drafted this open letter on funding mental health and migrant justice. And that kind of is quite an important document, we think, that outlines key considerations for funders who want to make sure grassroots groups are kind of recognized as those who can best serve their communities and who want to make sure that they're not excluded from access to funding because of an overly narrow focus on one issue or another issue. And so this was really interesting for us to get to this point, as I say before, from starting from a point where we wanted to understand work that was going on in the space, but we started from zero, and we got from there to having what is quite an important document that gets to the heart of why grassroots groups can't operate in the way that they'd like to. And it's a useful insight from intersectional representative groups. And the way that we got to this point was by trying our best to build equitable relationships with those groups so that we can have the best possible idea of how it is that of what their needs were and how we might be able to help them. And if we could just jump to the next slide, I just thought I'd share a couple of things that we learned about maybe how to build those equitable relationships so that you get the kind of communication with these representative intersectional groups that you would need in order to actually fund in a way that is useful to them. So first of all, in terms of language, we've always tried to make sure that our communication is as clear and jargon-free as possible when we're speaking to groups. That's something that we've had a lot of positive feedback on, and there's an incredible amount of jargon floated around, I think, in everywhere, basically, across the charity sector. So it's really important, we found, to avoid that as much as possible. We've made sure to ask in advance about accessibility needs on Zoom calls, and accommodate those as best we can. But we've also, by the same token, wanted to make sure that getting on a Zoom call is not the only way for groups to engage with this work that we're doing. So it's accessibility also is about, in our experience, not assuming that people always have time to get on a Zoom call, and actually being willing to not only send round notes after a meeting has happened, but where possible, give someone a call or get out to see them in person to update them on stuff that's happening in terms of this work. Almost finished. Will not waffle for too much longer, but another really important thing is to keep in mind how important groups' time is, especially when they're doing so much on the ground for their communities and responding in real time, as I say, to the impact of bad government policy. Try to pay for their time where you can, which is something that we did when we were initially kind of having conversations with groups to try and learn more about their work. And where you can't do that, I think it's really important to think what a group will get out of engaging with you, however you're asking them to engage with you. And that kind of feeds into the next and my last real point on this of how we've tried to build equitable relationships, which is to always be really mindful of power dynamics and try and analyze wherever you can, these power dynamics that are inherent in our relationships with groups that are, grassroots, not so professionalized. In our case as Ensign, we're kind of a medium-sized organization. We're definitely not a large organization, and we're not really a funder either, although we've done some small grants programs before. That's not what we do, but we remain a professionalized organization with a certain degree of influence, which can give some people the impression that we've got far more money, power, or influence than we actually do. So that's something that we have to be really transparent about. And we always need to be managing expectations with groups, where appropriate. And so in our experience, all of this can help you to build an equitable relationship with the kind of representative intersectional groups that should be funded, and that best represent the communities that they're a part of. And these relationships can afford you the insight that you need in order to fund in a way that's genuinely helpful and responsive to the needs of grassroots groups. So that's all from me. I don't know if you got anything to add to that, Rebecca, but that's what we found in our experience. So thanks very much.
I mean, that's great. Thank you so much, Kieran. I mean, the only thing I would add to that is this reminder to everyone of the difference between equity and justice. And again, justice requires us to break down the structures that recreate oppression entirely. And so some of those are those things that stand in the way between yourself and an equitable relationship with the organizations that represent individuals with multiple intersecting identities. But it also requires us to take a look at all of the barriers that stand in the way between the communities that deserve and need funding and the individuals who hold funding and finances. As Audre Lorde says, a lot of these systems are what she classifies as the master's tools. They are colonial tools of separation. And so we're going to break into what that means in terms of barriers, and the barriers between organizations and communities and resources that they need. So coming from really the wonderful work of Ensign and the mental health and migrant justice group, as well as the Intersectional DPO Forum that Disability Rights UK work with, and the co-production funding justice for DPO's group. There's lots of networks floating about at the moment. We've gathered some of the key barriers that we found to be most important to highlight to you. So quite similar to what Kieran said in terms of accessible language, but rather obviously is the inaccessible, long and text-heavy application forms that stand in the way between a community and the resources we need. We know that funders are sort of cluing into that. We're seeing that a lot of funders are breaking down those barriers, but what might not be broken down entirely is that very restrictive definitions of need. And in Ensign's report, the statement that really stuck out to me in our organizations the most is this reminder to funders that we are our community, and therefore we know what to do to serve our community. And it questions the way in which organizations make the decisions of what deserves to be funded, and therefore which often leads to very restrictive definitions of need, and meaning that organizations that know their community and have the flexibility to solve a problem from that expertise of lived experience are often marginalized in comparison to organizations that do not reflect the community that needs serving, but have done the same program over and over again. Similar to that is the lack of capacity building that going on in the sector at the moment, the lack of core funding that is being a growing issue amongst all voluntary but also disability rights organisations, and the dominance of top-down decision making. So quite similar to what I was talking about before, the decisions of what deserves to be funded, and as Kieran said before, the dominance of communication from a top-down versus bottom-up perspective. And Zeenat talks a little bit about how that reflects her experiences as an organisation.
So a barrier would be that we don't meet some of the criteria. So when you as a funder pick an area of work that you're trying to fund for the year, it can be quite specific. And if we haven't had no experience of that work, we're then rejected. So sometimes income levels are dependent on the grant funding. If we're too much, then we don't fit for the small grants, and we are medium sized. So, and if we've had no experience, we can't apply for the larger values of grants as well. So that's one example of a barrier.
Thank you so much for that, Kieran, and also Zeenat's, mainly for the recording's sake when she looks at this later on. So I'm going to bring everyone back to the question that I started this conversation on, considerate of the social justice position that we're taking, and also considerate of the many barriers and the bureaucracy that we've been talking about today. I would like to ask you all where you think the funding organisation sits in the metaphorical picture of reality, equity, equality and justice. So for those of you who can't see that, I'm bringing everyone back to that concept of three individuals trying to see a cricket game, and they are separated by a wall, and some have resources and some have more than others. I wondered if anyone has any thoughts on potentially where the funding organisation sits. Please use the chat function to pitch any thoughts. So we've just got a question from Dominique asking if I mean rather generally or your specific organisations. And to that, my answer is whatever, you can answer both. So you can say your organisations or the entire sector of funding organisations or the entire voluntary sector broadly. Please let me know your thoughts anytime. Okay, so we've got a few responses to the question. So some are talking really about what stages they are in these screens, so whether they're at liberation or equity, equality, and then some are talking about how they're represented in the image. And I just want to talk about one of them. So we've got one comment saying that funders have the tools needed to either build those platforms for people to stand in or pull down the fences, and that's really great. Thank you so much for that. So certainly, I mean, I couldn't agree more. So what we often talk about in this work, and rather obviously, is that funders are the distributors of resources or the builders of resources, and they can either distribute them equitably or on a quality stance, which is what a lot of people are talking about, whether they're distributing them in terms of equity or equality. But what I also want to push forward is this concept that is really growing across the sector, is that sometimes funders are the things that build the fences, the things that hold up the fences, and sometimes the fence itself standing in the way between the resources or the access that communities and community organisations have and don't have. And in order to reach justice, it requires those with power to break down the barriers entirely, to break down that separation that I was talking about between the funders and the funded, and to give directly to communities, and even ask ourselves if the way our organizations exist as is necessary as is to reach justice. And this is something that organizations are already talking about. Lankelly Chase is really interestingly dissolving their own separation, or their involvement in separating finances and financial resources between things like funding organizations and the community they serve. But that's a much broader question on funding, and hopefully not too doom and gloom there. We're going to take the last 10 minutes of today to really talk about the strategic plan that our organizations recommend going forward for our for funding organizations. And please feel free to, at this point in time, use the chat box to ask different questions or your thoughts on maybe you've done some of these things going forward, maybe you really want to, and maybe you have some questions about some of the strategies that we've put forward. So what do you do in week one? Well, it's pretty simple. It's all about reading, preparing, and getting those key engagements going forward. So the first thing we recommend is, in order to start a movement, you need to bring along people. So please go ahead and email your colleagues today and different individuals who know in your sector, maybe post on LinkedIn your learnings, if you've found any useful learnings on intersectionality from a social justice perspective. And then I know this certainly from my own experience, if it's not in my calendar, it's not going to get done. So go ahead and dedicate time in your calendar to over the next quarter to commit, and we'll be talking about what that quarter will look like in a second. This week, we also advise you to read the National Survivor User Network's open letter to funding mental health and migrant justice, of which Kieran, I believe, is just about to put a link into the chat. I see a nodding head, so that's brilliant. And then add some things to your full reading calendar as well. The National Survivor User Networks, along with our other organizations that are self-representative, are working with Disability Rights UK to grow on the learnings that we're accumulating over time. So we will be releasing a comprehensive position statement from those organizations in the fall. So what are you doing in that next quarter? Well, we hope that all those tweets and emails and posts on LinkedIn had a really good effect on your organization. Maybe you want to push it a little bit more, but to commit your organization to fund self-representation over or by the next 5 years. The next 8 areas of this quarter is a lot more critical and a lot more based in reviewing and growing relationships, as Kieran talked about. So the first thing we're going to be asking you to do from a critical point of view is to actually identify what organizations that you already fund are self-representative. If you don't know the answer to that question, that's fine, but it does also require you to ask them the tough question, to ask them, okay, we fund you, you're asking us for continuation funding, you're talking about a community, you're talking about intersectionality. What proportion of your workforce, your board of trustees, your leadership team identifies as the community that you're speaking about right now? It's a tough question. The third thing we ask you to do is to pitch for an intersectional focus for your next 3 to 5 or 10-year strategy, remembering that when this work starts to kick off, it must be done in parallel to that internal evaluation, or even afterwards if you find that that's most appropriate for your organization. And then the fourth thing that you'll be doing over the next quarter is to develop a relationship with our recommendation of being 10 intersectional community organizations. So we've already listed quite a bunch of them to you today, but certainly we're happy to foster some other introductions, or maybe you've already heard about them or you want to do some digging yourself. As Kieran talked about with Asian People's Disability Alliance, please go to their sites. We know that breaking down the bureaucracy and the separation between funders and organizations can be seen when you build a personal relationships, when you see for yourself the very lived day-to-day experiences of these community members. By the next year, we expect that you would have already asked the organizations that you built that wonderful relationship with what's needed. And you might even want to start thinking about a report, writing a report, accumulating their experiences and pitching it to the senior leadership team and board of trustees at your organizations. And once that gets wonderfully accepted, because I know you're all brilliant, we think that you should really start thinking about developing a paid co-production board of intersectional self-representative community organisations. And we say that this is important because of the learnings that we're accumulating today, the reports that's coming from DRUK and NSUN is just the start of this process. This must be based in the lived experiences of these organisations and not some sort of report that's coming from third or second tier organisations. So you need to be asking them, and you really importantly need to be paying them for their expertise. In the next year, both DRUK and NSUN will be launching events on funding justice, so please go ahead and attend that and email us both if you would like to be on that early sign-up list, and connect with the organisations that are already leading this change. So the networks that we've been talking about today are part of them, but we also pay homage, of course, to Kelly Chase's work and the Propel network of funders, of which our partner, Inclusion London, of the Funding Justice for DPOs programme are a part of and working with. And then by the 5 years, we expect that your organisation would have really started on creating a strong stance. You would have announced an intersectional strategy that is built in co-production, remembering that internal work needs to have been done first or in parallel to. And the second point tends to be one that organisations tend to flinch over, but it's really fundamentally important to start divesting from non-representative organisations and organisations that recreate harm for the communities that we serve and are marginalised in society. And we often find that they are one and the same. The third ask of the next 5 years is to break down all of the barriers in the existing scheme. Again, that work needs to be done in parallel. So all of the schemes that you're working on need to have a breakdown of those systematic barriers that prevent communities that we're working with from getting the resources that we need. And then by the end of the 5 years, you will have a critical evaluation of your internal representation. So you will know your staff all the way to your board of trustees, representation of the communities that you want to serve and their real experience of intersectionality. And maybe that critical evaluation also questions the role of the funding system exactly as it is in the broader context of social justice. So thank you so much. We do have an extra 2 minutes. I wonder if anyone had any questions to finish off today. Okay, that's brilliant. So certainly, yes, slides will be shared and I'm happy to just pop in my email into the chat for everyone.
Thank you, Rebecca, so much for that and for sharing your details with everyone. And yes, we'll send the slides out to all of you afterwards as well. That was a really brilliant session and great to have such a strong call to action for all our funders as well. So please do get in touch with Rebecca or Kieran as noted. And thank you so much for joining us today. We have just a few last sessions left and we wrap up the Festival of Learning tomorrow at the festival finale. Be great to see some of you there. We'll pop the link in the chat if you can sign up. But we are out of time now, so I won't keep you any longer. And just a huge thank you to everyone. Have a nice day.
Yep. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.